There is a moment right before you speak, when you still have all the power. The moment after, the words are gone, and so is your control. A man insults you in front of others, and every cell in your body screams to answer back. A message arrives that twists your stomach, and your thumbs are already moving before your mind has caught up. Someone doubts you, mocks you, provokes you, and silence feels like defeat. But what if I told you that the ancient Stoics discovered something so powerful, so counterintuitive, that it could have saved empires, marriages, friendships, and your own peace of mind? And it was this: never even think of answering. Not out of weakness, not out of fear, but out of a strength so complete that words become unnecessary. Stay until the end, because by the time this video is over, you will never look at silence the same way again. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the place where ancient wisdom meets modern struggle, where the words of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca are not dusty relics, but living tools for the battles you face today. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because every week we take the oldest philosophy in the world and use it to solve the newest problems in your life. Now settle in, because today's lesson might be the most important one you learn all year. The room where nobody spoke. Let me take you to Rome, sometime in the 2nd century. Picture the imperial palace, torches flickering against marble walls, the smell of oil lamps and parchment in the air. The emperor Marcus Aurelius sits at a long table, surrounded by senators, generals, and advisors. A man across the table, a senator with more ambition than wisdom, begins to speak. His words are sharp, calculated, designed to embarrass the emperor in front of the room. He questions a decision Marcus made weeks earlier. He implies weakness. He implies foolishness. The room goes quiet, the kind of quiet where everyone waits to see how power will react to disrespect. And Marcus Aurelius says nothing. He does not raise his voice. He does not defend himself. He does not even blink in irritation. He simply listens, lets the silence stretch a few seconds longer than comfortable, and then moves the conversation forward as if the insult had evaporated into the air the moment it was spoken. Later, in his private journal, the collection of thoughts we now call Meditations, he wrote something that should be carved into the mind of every person who has ever felt the urge to defend their ego, that the best revenge is to not be like that, not to mirror the pettiness, not to descend into the same mud that was thrown at you. This wasn't weakness. This was one of the most powerful men on earth, commander of legions, ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, choosing silence as his weapon, because he understood something the senator did not, that answering an insult gives it life, answering a provocation gives it power over you. The moment you respond, you have already lost something: your composure, your energy, your peace, even if your words are clever, even if you win the argument. Now ask yourself, how many times this week have you answered something you didn't need to answer? A comment online, a snide remark from a coworker, a passive-aggressive text from a friend. How much of your mental energy have you spent constructing responses, replaying arguments in the shower, rehearsing comebacks you'll never even get to use? The Stoics would look at that mental exhaustion and tell you something simple and devastating: you were never required to answer at all. Why your brain begs you to respond. Before we go further into what the Stoics taught, we need to understand why silence feels so unnatural, so uncomfortable, almost physically painful in certain moments. This isn't a character flaw. It's biology wrapped in centuries of social conditioning. When someone insults you, challenges you, or provokes you, your brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, lights up as if you were facing physical danger. Your body doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and a rude comment on the internet. It floods you with adrenaline and cortisol, prepares your muscles for fight or flight, and narrows your focus onto the threat. In ancient times, this reaction kept our ancestors alive. Today it keeps us trapped, arguing with strangers, snapping at people we love, sending messages we regret within minutes of hitting send. The tragedy is that most modern threats are not threats to your life. They are threats to your ego. And your ego, unlike your body, does not need saving. In fact, the more you rush to defend it, the more fragile it becomes, because you're teaching yourself that every attack requires a counterattack, that every doubt requires proof, that every insult requires a rebuttal. You become a slave to other people's provocations, jumping every time someone pulls the string. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and later became one of history's greatest philosophers, understood this better than almost anyone. He had lived through actual powerlessness, chained, beaten, owned by another human being, and yet he taught that true freedom has nothing to do with your circumstances and everything to do with your reactions. He said that we are disturbed not by events, but by our opinions about them. An insult in itself is just sound waves, just letters on a screen. It has no power until you decide it does. The moment you choose not to answer, not to engage, not to let it live rent-free in your mind, you take back the only thing that was ever truly yours to control, your response. Think about the last argument you had that spiraled out of control. Did it start with something enormous? Rarely. It usually starts small, a comment, a tone of voice, an assumption, and it grows because both sides keep answering, keep adding fuel, keep proving they had the last word. What if, at the very first spark, one person had simply chosen silence? Not a cold, punishing silence, but a calm, grounded silence, the kind that says, I don't need to prove anything to you. How many relationships would have survived? How many friendships would still be intact? How much peace would you have preserved? The Senecan warning about anger. Seneca, the Roman statesman and philosopher, wrote an entire book on this subject called On Anger. He described anger as a temporary madness, a state in which the mind briefly loses its grip on reason and hands control over to impulse. He warned that anger, more than any other emotion, convinces us that we are right precisely when we are least capable of judging rightly. It whispers that you must respond now, that waiting will look weak, that silence will be mistaken for defeat. Seneca advised something radical for his time and still radical for ours: delay. He said that when you feel the fire of anger rising, the wisest thing you can do is nothing at all, not permanently, but long enough for the fire to lose its first violent heat. Wait an hour, wait a day, sleep on it. He observed that almost every action taken in the grip of anger is later regretted, and almost every silence chosen in its place is later respected. Picture this in your own life. The email you wanted to send at 11 p.m. after a frustrating meeting, the one dripping with sarcasm and barely concealed contempt. What would have happened if you'd waited until morning? 9 times out of 10, morning, you looks at the draft and deletes it, grateful you never hit send. Seneca knew this 2,000 years before email existed, because human nature has not changed, only the tools we use to damage ourselves with it. The story of the philosopher and the fool. There's an old Stoic story, often attributed to the teachings passed down through Epictetus's students, about a philosopher walking through the marketplace. A man begins to mock him loudly, calling him names, trying to draw a crowd, hoping to humiliate him into a reaction. The philosopher walks on, calm, unaffected, as if the words were wind. Someone in the crowd asks him, "Why do you not defend yourself? Are you not angry?" And the philosopher replies, "If a donkey kicked you, would you kick it back?" The crowd laughs, not at the philosopher, but at the fool who had tried so hard to provoke him and failed. This is the essence of Stoic silence. It is not about pretending you feel nothing. It is about recognizing that some sources do not deserve the dignity of your energy. Answering a fool on his own terms makes you a participant in foolishness. Silence, chosen deliberately, elevates you above the exchange entirely. This is where so many people misunderstand Stoicism. They think it means suppressing emotion, becoming cold, becoming a statue. That is not what Marcus, Epictetus, or Seneca taught. They taught the opposite. Feel what you feel. Notice the anger, notice the hurt. Notice the injustice, but do not let that feeling dictate your action. There is a space between the provocation and your response, And in that space lies your entire freedom. The wider you make that space, the more powerful you become, when silence becomes your superpower. Let's bring this into the modern world, because ancient wisdom means nothing if it cannot survive contact with your actual life. Imagine you're in a group chat, and someone makes a comment clearly designed to embarrass you. Everyone is watching, at least virtually, waiting to see what you'll do. Every instinct tells you to fire back something clever, something that will win the exchange and restore your image. But consider what happens if you simply don't respond. Not out of cowardice, but out of choice. The comment sits there unanswered, and slowly, almost magically, it loses its power. It starts to look less like a clever jab and more like a small, desperate attempt to get a reaction. The less you feed it, the smaller it becomes. Meanwhile, you continue your day, unaffected, present, free. Consider the workplace. A colleague takes credit for your idea in a meeting. Your blood boils. You want to call it out immediately, publicly, to reclaim what's yours. But what if instead you calmly let the moment pass, gather your thoughts, and address it privately, strategically, later, when emotion is not steering the ship? Seneca would tell you that the person who reacts immediately often looks unstable, while the person who responds later, calmly, with clarity, looks like the only adult in the room. Silence in this case is not surrender. It is strategy. Consider family. A parent, a sibling, a partner says something cutting, something meant to provoke an old wound. You know exactly how to hurt them back. You've known each other for years. You know exactly where it stings. But what if you didn't use that knowledge? What if instead of turning a heated moment into a war, you simply held your tongue, let the moment breathe, and responded hours later with calm instead of a weapon? How many family relationships have been destroyed not by the original wound, but by the retaliation that followed it? This is the practice the Stoics are asking of you. Not to become passive, not to let people walk over you, but to separate the moment of provocation from the moment of response, so that when you do speak, you speak from strength, not from wounded pride. Marcus Aurelius and the Daily Battle. Marcus Aurelius did not write meditations for an audience. He wrote it for himself as a private journal, reminding himself every single day of the same lessons, because even an emperor, even the most powerful man in the known world, had to fight his own impulse to react, to defend, to answer every slight thrown his way. He wrote to himself that when he woke each morning, he should remind himself that he would encounter people who were ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, and unsociable. He didn't write this to become bitter or defensive in advance. He wrote it so that when those people inevitably showed up, as they always do, he would not be shocked, would not be thrown off balance, and would not feel the need to answer their behavior with behavior of his own kind. He reminded himself that he had seen the nature of good and could recognize it as beautiful, and had seen the nature of evil and could recognize it as ugly, and that no one could implicate him in that ugliness against his will. This is such a profound idea, it's worth repeating. No one can make you ugly against your will. When someone insults you and you fire back an equally cruel insult, you have allowed them to make you into something you did not choose to be. You've let their behavior dictate yours. But if you refuse to answer in kind, if you meet cruelty with composure, meet chaos with calm, you remain exactly who you decided to be, regardless of what anyone else does. This is the deepest form of self-respect. Not proving yourself to others, but refusing to be shaped by their provocations. The cost of every answer. Here's something worth sitting with. Every single time you answer a provocation, you pay a price, even if you don't notice it. You pay in mental energy, the hours spent replaying the exchange, crafting the perfect response, wondering if you said too much or not enough. You pay in reputation, because people remember not just what was said to you, but how you responded. And a reactive, defensive response often reflects worse on you than the original insult ever did. You pay in peace, because your mind, once engaged in conflict, does not simply switch off. It carries the tension into your sleep, your work, your relationships with people who had nothing to do with the original conflict. Seneca compared anger to a person who, in trying to throw a stone at an enemy, ends up standing so close that the enemy is barely scratched while the thrower's own hand is torn open by the effort. This is what happens every time you answer something beneath your dignity. You believe you're striking outward, but the deepest wound often lands on yourself. Now compare this to the cost of silence. What do you lose by not answering? Almost nothing. Perhaps a fleeting sense of winning an exchange that no one will remember in a week. Perhaps the temporary satisfaction of feeling clever. But what you gain is enormous. Your peace remains intact. Your energy stays yours. Your reputation as someone who cannot be provoked grows stronger with every test that you pass. The people who cannot be shaken. Think of anyone you admire for their composure, a mentor, a grandparent, a historical figure, a public figure you respect. What do they have in common? Almost always it's this: they do not react to everything. They choose their battles with precision. They let small things pass without comment, and when they do speak, their words carry weight precisely because they are rare, deliberate, and unrushed. Compare this to someone who answers everything, every slight, every rumor, every provocation. Over time, their words lose value. People stop taking their reactions seriously because they react to everything equally, whether the provocation is enormous or trivial. Their currency of speech becomes inflated, worthless, because they've spent it too freely. This is one of the most practical lessons hidden inside Stoic philosophy. Your silence is currency. Spend it wisely, and your words, when you finally choose to use them, will carry more weight than 1,000 instant reactions ever could. A story from the modern world. Let me tell you about a man, we'll call him David, though his story represents thousands like him, who ran a small business for over a decade. A former employee, fired for poor performance, began spreading false rumors online, tagging clients, writing long, aggressive posts accusing David of things that never happened. Every instinct told David to respond immediately, to defend himself publicly, to counter every lie with a fact. Instead, David did something that surprised everyone around him. He said nothing publicly. He continued running his business, continued serving his clients with the same quality as before, continued showing up every day with quiet consistency. Weeks passed. The former employee, receiving no reaction, no fuel for the fire, eventually grew tired, moved on to other targets, and the posts faded into irrelevance. Clients who had seen the accusations watched David's continued calm behavior and drew their own conclusions, that a man who did not need to defend himself so loudly was probably a man who had nothing to hide. Had David answered immediately, with anger, with counter-accusations, he would have handed the former employee exactly what she wanted: a public battle, a spectacle, a story with two loud sides instead of one calm truth. Instead, his silence became the loudest statement of all. This is not a call to never defend yourself when defense is genuinely necessary. There are times when clarification, correction, or boundary setting matters. But the Stoics ask you to examine honestly how many of your reactions are truly necessary, and how many are simply your ego demanding satisfaction it does not actually need. How to practice this, the space between. So how practically do you build this ability? How do you train yourself to pause where once you would have exploded? The first step is awareness. Notice the physical sensations that arise the moment you feel provoked, the tightening in your chest, the heat rising in your face, the urge in your fingers to type immediately. The Stoics called this the first movement, an automatic reaction that even the wisest among us cannot fully prevent. But they insisted that what happens next is entirely within your control. You cannot stop the spark, but you decide whether it becomes a fire. The second step is delay. Give yourself a rule, even something as simple as counting to 10, or waiting until you've taken 3 full breaths, or refusing to respond to any message that upset you until at least an hour has passed. This single habit, practiced consistently, will save you from more regret than almost any other discipline you could build. The third step is asking yourself a Stoic question before you respond. Is this within my control? Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that other people's opinions, judgments, and behavior were not his to control, only his own actions were. If someone insults you, their insult is theirs. Your response is yours. Ask yourself, will answering this actually change anything for the better, or will it simply satisfy a temporary itch while creating a longer problem? The fourth step is remembering the audience that matters. Not the crowd watching to see if you'll react, but the version of yourself a week from now, a year from now, looking back on this moment. Will future you be proud of how you handled this? Or will future you wince, wishing you'd stayed quiet? The fifth step, and perhaps the hardest, is releasing the need to be understood by everyone. Not every person deserves an explanation. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every provocation deserves an audience with your attention. Some things are simply beneath the cost of your energy, and recognizing which battles fall into that category is one of the highest forms of wisdom the Stoics ever taught. The discipline of not explaining yourself. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from no longer needing to explain yourself to people who were never going to understand anyway. So many of us exhaust ourselves trying to justify our choices to people who have already decided, before we even speak, that they will not believe us. We send long messages defending our character to people who enjoy tearing it down. We construct arguments in our heads for critics who were never listening for the truth, only for ammunition. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from what happens to us, but from our judgment about what happens to us. And a huge portion of that suffering comes from caring too much about the judgment of people whose opinion should hold no real weight in our lives. Ask yourself honestly, of all the people whose criticism keeps you up at night, how many of them have earned the right to that level of influence over your peace? How many of them have shown you wisdom, love, or good judgment in the past? Often the answer is very few, and yet we hand our silence, our composure, our entire sense of self-worth over to strangers, acquaintances and people who wish us harm, as if their words carry more truth than our own lived experience of who we are. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine feedback from people who care about you and know you well. Stoicism was never about isolating yourself from correction or growth. It was about discernment, knowing which voices deserve your attention and which deserve your silence. When silence is mistaken for weakness, one of the greatest fears people have about staying silent is that others will mistake it for weakness, for defeat, for having nothing to say. This fear is powerful, and it's worth addressing directly, because the Stoics were not naive about how the world works. Yes, some people will misinterpret your silence. Some will claim victory simply because you didn't engage with their provocation. But here is the truth the Stoics understood deeply. The opinion of those people was never something you could control anyway, and chasing their approval, even the approval that comes from winning an argument, is a losing game from the start. There will always be someone ready to declare victory regardless of what you do. The only opinion that truly matters is the one you hold of yourself when you look back on how you carried yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote that it is not death that a man should fear, but that he should fail to begin to live in accordance with nature, meaning in accordance with reason, virtue, and calm judgment. A momentary loss of face in the eyes of someone whose opinion means nothing is a small price for the enormous gain of self-respect, clarity, and peace that comes from choosing not to descend into a fight that was never worth having. And here's something almost paradoxical. The people who most respect you, the people whose opinions actually matter, are rarely impressed by a clever comeback. They are far more impressed by composure. They are far more impressed by someone who can be provoked and simply not react. That quality, the quality of being unshakable, is rare, and rarity commands respect in a way that reactive cleverness never can. The modern battlefield, social media, and the illusion of urgency. We live in an age engineered to make us answer everything. Notifications demand instant replies. Comment sections reward the fastest, sharpest, most emotionally charged responses. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage keeps us scrolling. keeps us engaged, keeps us hooked into cycles of provocation and reaction that generate profit for platforms and exhaustion for us. The Stoics never faced smartphones, but they faced the same fundamental trap in different clothing, the trap of believing that every provocation demands an immediate answer, that silence in the face of accusation is somehow dangerous. Seneca warned against exposing yourself constantly to crowds because he said that even a brief exposure to a chaotic crowd could undo days of careful inner work. Imagine what he would say about scrolling through hundreds of provocations a day, each one designed by algorithm to trigger exactly the reaction that keeps you glued to the screen. Practicing the discipline of not answering, in this context, becomes almost an act of rebellion against the entire architecture of modern attention. When you see a comment designed to enrage you, and you simply close the app instead of typing a response, you are doing something genuinely radical. You are refusing to be a puppet pulled by strings you didn't choose. You are reclaiming ownership over your own mind in an environment engineered to steal it from you. A question for you. I want you to think right now about the last time you answered something you shouldn't have. Maybe it was a message. Maybe it was a comment section. Maybe it was a family dinner where someone said something designed to provoke you, and you took the bait. What did it cost you? Not just in the moment, but in the hours or days afterward, the replaying, the regret, the tension it created. Now imagine instead that you had simply let it pass. Not suppressed it, not pretended it didn't happen, but consciously chosen not to give it the fuel of your reaction. How different would that day have felt? I'd genuinely love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me about a moment where staying silent turned out to be the wisest thing you ever did, or a moment where you wish you had stayed silent but didn't. This channel is built on real stories, from real people applying ancient wisdom to modern struggles, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. The deeper layer, silence is overcorrection. Beyond the practical benefits, saved energy, protected reputation, avoided conflict, there is a deeper, almost spiritual dimension to this practice that the Stoics valued above all else. Self-mastery. To the Stoics, the highest achievement a human being could reach was not wealth, not fame, not power over others, but mastery over the self. And nothing tests that mastery more directly than the moment someone tries to provoke you into losing control. Every time you feel the urge to answer and choose not to, you are training a muscle. You are proving to yourself, in a small but real way, that you are the one in charge of your mind, not the person trying to provoke you, not your own impulsive emotions, not the fear of looking weak. Over time, this muscle grows stronger. Provocations that once would have consumed your entire day begin to slide off you, like water off stone. Insults that once would have kept you awake at night become background noise, barely worth a second thought. This is what the Stoics meant by freedom, not freedom from consequence, not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from being controlled by your own reactions. Epictetus, a man who had been a literal slave, taught that the person who cannot control his own passions is enslaved just as surely as if he wore chains, regardless of his outward circumstances, and the person who has mastered his reactions is free, regardless of what chains, literal or metaphorical, surround him. The danger of overcorrection. Now, it's important to address a misunderstanding that often creeps in here. Choosing not to answer every provocation does not mean becoming someone who never speaks up, who lets themselves be walked over indefinitely, who mistakes complete passivity for wisdom. That is not Stoicism. That is simply suppression, and suppression eventually breaks. The Stoics were not passive men. Marcus Aurelius led armies into brutal campaigns. Seneca navigated the treacherous politics of Nero's court. Epictetus built an entire school of philosophy from nothing after gaining his freedom. These were not men who avoided all conflict. They were men who chose their conflicts deliberately, who spoke when speaking served a purpose, and who stayed silent when silence served a greater one. The goal is not silence for its own sake. The goal is intentionality. Before you answer anything, ask yourself, does this deserve my voice? Will speaking now serve truth, justice, or a relationship worth protecting? Or will it simply feed my ego's need to be right, to be heard, to win? If the answer is the former, speak, calmly, clearly, without the heat of anger clouding your words. If the answer is the latter, let it pass, and save your voice for something that actually matters. The long-term transformation. Imagine practicing this discipline for a full year. Imagine every single time you feel the urge to fire back a defensive comment, you pause and ask the questions we've discussed today. Imagine every time someone tries to provoke you online, you simply close the app instead of typing a response. Imagine every time a family member says something designed to hurt you, you let a full day pass before responding, if you respond at all. What would change? Your relationships would likely deepen, because the people around you would begin to trust that you're not reactive, that you can be told hard truths without exploding, that conversations with you feel safe rather than combustible. Your reputation would shift, because people would begin to see you as someone unshakable, someone whose calm cannot be disturbed by petty provocations, and that quality, more than almost any other, commands quiet respect in every arena of life. From business to family to friendship, your own inner world would transform most of all. The constant background noise of resentment, rehearsed arguments, and imagined confrontations would quiet down, because you would no longer be feeding it daily. You would have more mental space for the things that actually matter: your work, your creativity, your relationships, your own growth, because you would no longer be spending hours of your one finite life defending yourself against people and comments that were never worth the cost. The final story. Let's return to Marcus Aurelius one final time, because there's a passage in Meditations that captures everything we've discussed today in a single devastating line. He reminded himself that very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He understood, at the height of imperial power, surrounded by flatterers, enemies, and provocateurs of every kind, that his peace was never dependent on what others said or did. It was dependent entirely on what he chose to do with his own mind in response. This is the gift the Stoics are offering you, across 2,000 years of distance, through the words we've explored today. You do not have to answer everything. You do not have to defend every accusation, respond to every provocation, or win every argument. In fact, the person who has truly mastered themselves understands that most provocations do not deserve an answer at all. They deserve silence, patience, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows their own worth does not depend on convincing anyone else of it. The next time someone insults you, doubts you, or tries to provoke a reaction, pause. Feel the urge rise, notice it, acknowledge it, and then ask yourself the question that could change the entire trajectory of that moment. Does this actually deserve my answer? More often than you think, the wisest, strongest, most powerful thing you can do is never even think of answering at all. If this video gave you even a moment of clarity, even one idea you'll carry into your next difficult conversation, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these words today. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics, because every week we bring you the timeless teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, translated into practical wisdom for the life you're actually living right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who answers too quickly, argues too often, or carries the weight of every provocation thrown their way. And I'll leave you with this. The next time you feel the fire rising, the urge to answer, to defend, to prove, remember that silence, chosen deliberately, is not the absence of strength. It is strength in its purest, most unshakable form. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.